I just read the brief biodata of Dr. John Falk. Dr. John Falk is the principal of John F. Falk LLC and Emeritus C. Grant Professor of Free Choice Learning at Oregon State University. He has the founder and longtime CEO of the Institute for Learning Innovations. Internationally recognized as a leading expert on well-being and free choice learning, Dr. Falk has been investigating why people go to museums, what they do there, and what benefits they derive from these experiences for more than 50 years. And it is very interesting to tell our students that free choice learning is the term which is coined by Dr. Falk and also his colleague, Dr. Lin. So both they coined this term. And it is very interesting to know that not only museum studies, Dr. Falk is also an expert in ecology and evolutionary biology. It's very interesting to know, and he's world expert in lawn. Anybody can surprise that lawn can be a matter of research, and Dr. since 30 years on lawn, type of lawn, everything, ecological aspect, every aspect. So he also authored over 250 articles and chapters, hundreds of technical reports, and more than 2 dozen books. And I was just surfing the Google Scholar page of Dr. Falk, and it is fascinating to share with you that he has more than 37,000 of citations of his research publications, with almost more than 80 H index, and also have I-10 index 155. Very remarkable. I'm the fraternity of museum study and everything. So his most recent book are The Value of Museums, Enhancing Societal Well-being and Leaning into Value, Becoming a User-Focused Museum. Like all his works, these books emphasize the importance of viewing the museum experiences through the eyes of the user. Now we welcome you, sir. We are very fortunate to have you. And here are our MTech fellow and other fellow. They are connected at different science centers all over India. Welcome, sir. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Namaste. I'm delighted to be here and talking with everybody. I have over many years spent a lot of time in India. In fact, I think I've spent over a year of my life in India, collectively on many trips, although I haven't been there in a decade or so. So what I'm going to talk about today is understanding learning in museums. But to understand learning in museums, we have to step back and appreciate that all the people who come to museums come with backgrounds and experiences and realities related to their time and their experience. And we live in a time in which learning is everywhere. Learning is lifelong. Learning is life-wide. And I'll explain those terms more. And learning in general and science in particular, since I'm going to assume that many, if not most of you, are interested in science learning, is rapidly becoming integral to every aspect of our life, work, and leisure. In fact, the boundaries, historically, learning was something you did in school, and then you went to work and you worked, and what you did for work was at work, and then you went home at night, and on the weekends you had leisure time. But all of those boundaries are becoming ever more blurred. And we need to think about that if we want to think about learning in museums, as well as the fact that learning is lifelong. Again, children spend just a tiny fraction of their waking hours actually in school. Most of their waking hours are outside of school. And over the course of a lifespan, Schooling represents, again, this tiny fraction of a person's life. Most of what we learn through free choice learning. And thank you for talking about that. And free choice learning is the learning that is determined by the learner. It's determined by what that learner wants to know and wants to learn and is curious about, or in fact needs to know. Most of us don't know a whole lot about plumbing, but if the kitchen sink starts leaking, we'll put on a YouTube video to try and figure out how to fix the leak, and then decide if it's worth fixing. Much of learning today is on demand. So to help illustrate that the words learning, education, and school are not synonyms. Some learning happens in school, some education happens in school, but most learning, most education happens outside of school. Let's envision a life space of 70 plus years, waking hours from 7 to 11, hours of the day, um, uh, and in that lifespan, um, there's a little bit of space where children are going to school, and if they're lucky, there's another slice where they go to college. But the rest of this life space is where free choice learning happens, and that's a lot of space. That's a lot of time. Um, I said that learning is life wide. What I mean is learning happens in many, many places, in many ways. People learn from watching television, they learn from going to museums, they learn from reading books, they learn on the job, they learn from reading magazines, and increasingly through games and other kinds of videos, YouTube videos, things like that. They learn from travel if they're lucky. Um, they learn a lot from their parents, from their family. Um, they learn in school. They learn through clubs and hobbies. They learn by using AI or Google. And they learn through going to places like hobby shows and other kinds of experiences like that. Um, all these places contribute to people's learning. And in summary, we can say people learn, especially science, across their lifetime from many places, for many reasons, most of them related to their own personal needs and interests. Out of school experiences make a significant contribution to the public's learning. In fact, my own research would suggest that, at least in the United States, um, children learn as much science out of school as they learn in school. And over the course of their life, what they learn outside of school is of greater significance than what they learn in school. Learning is a never-ending cumulative process. And if we think about it that way, we need to appreciate that we should design educational experiences and interventions in ways that build on our learners' prior experiences and lead to subsequent experiences. And with that background in mind, let's talk about learning in museums. Turns out we currently know quite a bit about the nature of learning. I will say when I started 50 years ago in doing this work, we didn't know much about how people learned in museums. In fact, 50 years ago, nobody believed really that people did learn in museums. They thought they just had fun, particularly places like science centers, interactive science centers. So the first interactive science centers in the United States and Canada and India and Europe, people said, well, yeah, they're okay, but people are Those kids are just running around having fun. They're not really learning. We know today that people who go to science centers actually learn quite a bit. We also know quite a bit about the factors that significantly contribute to museum learning and how they interact. And that's what I'm going to primarily talk about this evening for you, this early morning for me. So let's do that. So what do we know about learning in museums? Well, if we know anything about learning in museums, we know these four things. Learning begins with the individual, it involves others, it takes place in a unique physical setting, and it happens over time. We can characterize that. In fact, my colleague Lynn Derkin and I characterize this as what we call the contextual model of learning. And we can think of this learning happening over time in these three contexts: the personal context, the physical context, and the sociocultural context. It starts with what people already know, what they bring with them. It happens with other people. It takes place someplace, and it happens over time. So let's talk about each of these contexts one at a time, starting with the personal context. Again, the personal context is what people bring with them to a learning experience. They bring their prior knowledge and experience. They bring expectations and motivations. They bring with them interest and the capacity for interest. And they bring with them a need for choice and control. One of the things, if we've learned anything about learning in the past decades, and it's fair to say we've discovered more about how people learn in the past several decades than we understood from the previous millennia of trying to understand learning, is that all learning is what's called constructed. We make sense of the world based on what we already know and understand. Each of you in this room brings with you a wealth of prior knowledge and experience related to the topic we're talking about today. And the only way you are making sense of what I'm saying is based on your own knowledge and experience. But since each of you have different backgrounds and different experiences, each of you is making sense of what I'm saying in a slightly different way. I'm going to suggest that you probably have collectively more similar experiences to each other than you probably have to me. So your ability to make sense of what I'm saying is different than my ability to make sense of what I'm saying. But each is unique and determined by what you already know. And that is true of everybody who walks into a museum or a science center. They can only make sense of what they see there based on what they already know. And that current knowledge and experience essentially creates a lens through which all subsequent knowledge and experience are viewed, and a framework, a foundation on which all learning is constructed. What people know when they walk in the door is the foundation on which they build whatever they're going to learn that day. But people don't just come with knowledge and understanding, they also come with expectations and motivations. Everybody who walks into a museum or science center has knowledge and expectations. For many, it's based on having been there before or been to similar places before. But even if not, even the youngest child who's coming for the very first time ever to a museum or science center has heard things about museums and science centers, has heard things about from brothers and sisters and others about what they can expect. So everybody walks in the door with expectations. And those motivations can be very internal, intrinsic. I hope I get to see this. I've heard about that. I want to be able to do Y because that's something I'm interested in. Or they can be extrinsic. In other words, I'm just eager to see whatever I can see. And I'm excited because I've heard there's some amazing things here. Visitor expectations and motivations. Ultimately, if prior knowledge and experience is the foundation of what people learn, expectations and motivations are the engine that drive visitor experiences. Because what I've discovered is people by and large use the museum to satisfy their expectations and motivations. So they're hoping to see something X, they're hoping to learn something Y, they're hoping to accomplish something Z, and then they use the museum to fulfill those expectations. Humans are curious creatures. We're always seeking new information and new understanding. Again, that interest can be extrinsic. So we know, for example, that people who go to museums and science centers, they particularly find interesting things that they find unusual or novel. They like big things. They're attracted to big things. And they're also attracted to things they've heard are important, or because of the way they're presented, they're important. You know, there's an exhibit that has lots of stuff in it, and then there's another big exhibit that is just all by itself. Maybe a big dinosaur skeleton, a Diplodocus or something like that. Well, that must be really important and must be really interesting because it's so big and it's right there in the middle of the museum. And these things pique our interest. But interest can also be intrinsic, as I said, based on past experiences. We bring our interests and curiosities with us. And it is a surprising but really interesting phenomenon that the topics that people find most interesting, that they're most curious about, and hence what they learn most about when they visit a science center, are things that they already know a little bit about. You would like to believe that we're presenting things at museums and science centers that are totally outside people's experience, that they would learn new things about. But what attracts people by and large are the things that they can already say, I'm interested in, I'm curious about that, I know a little bit about. In fact, I've discovered over many years that the primary thing people learn when they go to a museum are about things that they already know a little bit about, rather than new things. And then finally, the last of these factors is that as humans, we like to feel in control of our learning and of our experiences, and we like to have choices. One of the reasons that museums are such amazing learning settings is because they are free choice, and they do give choice and control to the learner in ways that often schools, for example, do not, in ways that often our workplace does not give us choice and control. But science centers and museums are full of choices and full of opportunities to pick and choose to learn about the things that you find interesting. In fact, some research done a number of years ago in Australia basically suggested that on a typical school visit, what children do initially, if you let them, they will run around and look at everything in the museum, and they'll push the buttons and whatever. But if you give them time, after they've run around and had a sense of what is there, they'll then go back to the exhibits that really pique their curiosity and their interest, and they'll spend time on those. And those will be the experiences that they take away and remember, to be honest, for a lifetime. Museums are social and cultural contexts. People come to museums with other people. Virtually nobody comes to a museum or science center alone. And that's true whether you're in India or the United States or Europe or China. They're social settings. And they come, again, with cultural backgrounds. And those cultural backgrounds matter. And who they come to the museum with matters. And who they encounter at the museum equally matters. In fact, for most visitors to museums, the social interactions they have shape their learning and their recollections. And so for many people, for example, many parents who bring their children to museums, if you ask them weeks, months, years later to talk about what they remember about their visit, they don't remember so much what they did. What they'll remember is what their children did, because they came to the museum for their children rather than for themselves. And therefore, what they remember is what their children did. And they can tell you all about what their children saw and did. But then if you ask them, so what did you look at? They said, well, I was spending so much time with my child. I wasn't looking at anything. I was looking at my child. And actually, did they learn anything? Well, absolutely, they learned things, but they learned them through the eyes of their children. And that what they learned was more about their children. So they learned a lot. It just wasn't necessarily the things we thought that they might learn. But we also learn from the other people. People watch other people in the museum, particularly people who haven't been to a museum before. They watch the other people in the museum in order to learn how to act and behave in the museum. And of course, what often makes museum experiences special are the interactions they have with guides and interpreters, the science shows that they watch. Nothing is more special than to be selected by the person leading the science show and asked to come up and be part of an experiment. That creates a lasting memory, a lifelong memory of that experience. And people can tell you about that and talk about that 30, 40 years after they visited the museum. And I know that in India, many of the visitors to places like science centers come in school groups. And nearly every museum offers programs, especially for schools. And school groups are a special context, but they're a social context as well. The children who come to the museum as part of a school group, they have agendas and motivations, which may not be the same as your agenda or the school's agenda. The school wants to think that all the children are coming there just to learn about what's at the museum. That may or may not be the child's agenda for being there. We need to take as much time and effort to understand the background of the children, each of which are different, their prior knowledge and experience, their interests, each of which are different on a school field trip. Each child's experience is different. Each child's interest is different. The social dynamics of that school field trip are important to take into consideration. These are not one size fits all. It is not, we shouldn't be thinking about school field trips as we have this field trip for this grade and we do the exact thing every time a school class of this grade comes. That is not going to lead to the best educational experience for those children. Much like we would with other visitors, we need to think of them as individuals with expectations and motivations and interests and prior knowledge, and we need to take that into consideration. And then finally, we come to the physical context. Museums are unusual places. They are not the kind of places where people go to in their everyday life. And they don't look like the spaces we usually go to. They're not filled with the kind of stuff that we're usually used to seeing. They are novel, they are different. And in fact, that's why we go to museums and science centers, because they are different. And so we should accommodate that when we think about the nature of learning. When I started in this business 50 years ago, 99.999% of all the research that had ever been done on learning happened in one of two settings, either a laboratory or school. There was no recognition or appreciation for the fact that where you were made a difference. They assumed that, well, it doesn't matter. We're studying learning. Why would we worry about that? Learning happens in school, and we can try and control that and do it in a laboratory. But in fact, the context matters. And our settings, our physical settings of museums matter a lot in determining how and what people learn, because of their novelty, because of their characteristics, because of how we design them. And then I had to put time someplace, so I threw it in here. But that's really a separate experience, separate element. So some of the earliest research that I did on novelty and orientation, I actually did in India at the National Museum of Natural History in Delhi. And there were children who were coming to this science center, many of them from villages, who were being bused to the museum. They had actually, many of those children, never been to Delhi, let alone a place like the Science Center. They had never been any place that had carpet before. They had never ridden on an elevator before. And so they spent their time, they were just all abuzz about the fact that they could ride up and down in an elevator, that they could walk on this really strange substance called carpet that they'd never experienced before in their life. And they learned lots of things, but they didn't necessarily learn much about natural history. But what they did learn about is carpet and elevators. We work in these settings, and so we tend to think of them as normal, but they're not normal. And so we need to understand that when we are trying to support the learning of others and creating these environments, that these environments make a difference and people react to them. And we need to account for them and accommodate those reactions when we design our experiences. Because frankly, if you give people too much novelty, it's actually scary. If you give them too little novelty, if it feels like a prison or a school, that actually has been shown to depress learning. But the right level of novelty can create wonders in terms of supporting learning. And if we provide appropriate orientation, particularly for kids before school field trips, we can maximize the benefit that novelty provides our learners. But again, like so much else, novelty is not a standard thing. Novelty is relative to the individual. The first time I walked into a museum, it was a novel setting for me. But after walking into hundreds of museums, museums are no longer novel. When you work at a place, you go there every day, and no longer is it novel. But the first time you walked in, it was novel. It was different. Most of the people who come to our settings are there for the first or maybe the second or third time in their lives. And for them, it's very, very novel. And we need to take that into consideration when we design these experiences. And all the various elements of space and sound and smell and textures and colors and how we place the objects and lines of sight. If you're a parent and you're bringing a child to a busy science center, uh, you want to be able to see them because you're afraid they might get lost if there are all these people there. And so creating spaces that allow parents to have a line of sight and feel comfortable letting their children run around is really important. So for children's museums, creating spaces where children can't get lost is really important. All these different factors, there are so many things that we have to take into consideration when we design a science center. Even though the practice historically is we designing one exhibit at a time, but each of these exhibits fit into this complex whole. And if we want to understand and support learning, we need to think about it as a whole, not just as the pieces. And that's equally true of all the aspects of design, including labels. Good design makes all the difference between supporting learning or having bad design, creates limitations and boundaries to learnings. And of course, not every learner is the same. So we need to build our experiences, we need to build our exhibits in ways that support multiple learners of different motivations, learners with different disabilities, learners with different learning styles, and learners who come in groups of different sizes. So rarely are we designing an exhibit where only one person is going to be there. If you think about your experience and imagine your science center or a science center that you've been to, it's not an empty space. It's full of people. And virtually every exhibit has multiple people around it at the same time. We need to design those experiences so that they work best when there are multiple people there, because that's the norm, not the exception. Again, the same principles apply to labels. We need to make the labels legible. We need to make the font size big enough. There are people who design PowerPoints like this, and they use tiny, tiny font that you can't read. You need to be able to sit back where you are and read the font. So the smallest font that I used in this PowerPoint was 28. Most of the font was 32 or larger, because I was mindful of the fact that all of you would be sitting out there and wanting to be able to read this. Hopefully you can. It needs to be a type of font that's easy to read. It needs to be at a height that makes sense. If you've ever been to a museum where the labels are way up high and they're children, and you see all these parents struggling to pick up their children so they can see the objects and read the labels, that's crazy. That's bad design. Nobody should ever have to do that. The labels and the objects should be at the height of the people who are visiting the museum. And if you have people at different height, which you do, then maybe you need to have labels at different heights and objects at different heights. It's often and interactives at different heights so that different size visitors can interact with them easily. And making them the average height, all that does is make it that only a small percentage of people actually is at the right height for them. Because if some visitors are a meter high and some visitors are 2 meters high, creating the experience at 1.5 meters doesn't serve the people either at 1 meter high or the people at 2 meters high. It only serves the people who are 1.5 meters high. So we need to create experiences that people can see and enjoy at whatever height they are, wherever they're coming from. Again, this is the value of seeing the museum experience through the eyes of the visitor as opposed to the eyes of the designer. And of course, the goal is not to write a book and put it on the wall. The goal is to help people quickly and effectively make sense of what they're doing. People don't start by reading labels. They start with the objects, with the interactives, and if it intrigues them, then they go back and read the label. So you need to think about the label as explaining to someone what they just saw or did, as opposed to explaining what they should see or should do, because they're not going to read the labels first. By and large, they read the labels second. And then finally, as I said, time matters. Time matters a lot. People come in with prior experience and knowledge and interests and expectations and curiosity, and that drives the visit. But ultimately, if we want these to last, we need to appreciate that learning is never instantaneous. And so memories are built over time. And so the more we can create opportunities for visitors to remember their experiences and to have subsequent experiences reinforcing them is really important. And we may think that having people take pictures of themselves at the museum is trivial and unimportant, but when people go back and look at those pictures, they serve as reinforcements. We may think that buying stuff in the gift shop is trivial and unimportant, but every souvenir that a child buys, every object or gift that somebody buys in the gift shop is a way to continue the experience past the time of the experience. Every opportunity that we can try and reconnect with visitors over time or create experiences that allow them to build on that, on their museum visit experience over time, is one step closer to helping build lasting memories and lasting learning for the visitor. These experiences, by and large, we need to remember that people have lives and learning is life-wide, lifelong. These are just little experiences in the midst of a whole lifetime of experience. And if we are serious about building lasting and meaningful learning experiences in museums, we need to find ways to stitch what happens in this little box called the museum in time and space, and stitch that to all the experiences people have before they come and after they leave. And the more successful we have, the more lasting and more significant is the learning experience that we create. So in summary, learning happens to individuals that bring their expectations and motivations to the museum. They bring their prior knowledge and experience, their prior interest, their perceived choice and control, and their desire for choice and control. They bring that every time they come to the museum. And they can go to the same museum twice with different expectations and different motivations. And as a consequence, if I go to the museum twice, and one time I go by myself because I'm curious, and the second time I go because I'm a parent with my child, I'll have an entirely different experience and be concerned about entirely different things and learn entirely different things. Same person, but different motivations can change that. Everybody comes to the museum with a cultural background, and those cultural backgrounds can be entirely different. If one thing that I discovered and love about India, if you could say anything about India, it is that it is a culturally complex and diverse country. People come with enormously different backgrounds and experiences. Every region every part of India is rich with cultural history. And people bring those cultural histories and experiences with them when they come to the museum. And they may come with very different expectations and even notions of what learning is than the people who work in the museum. So if we're going to be successful, we need to understand those cultural backgrounds and design for that diversity. We need to design for the interactions that happen within social groups, and we need to facilitate and design for experiences that happen when the public meets our staff and interacts with staff or guides or teachers for that matter. And then finally, these are amazingly unique physical settings, contexts, and we need to both accommodate and understand how that affects people, but we can ride that wave, we can design for that novelty and take advantage of it as a way to facilitate learning. But we need to, like riding a wave, we need to judge the wave. And if we judge it wrong, we'll either miss the wave or we'll get wiped out by the wave. So if we do it right, we can surf and take advantage of the energy created by that wave. That's what good design does. Good design builds on people's experiences, takes advantage of the novelty, takes advantage of the space, of the colors, of the smells, of the feelings, of the textures, of the emotions that are created in the experience, and rides that wave to build great learning experiences. But like a wave, surfing doesn't just happen. You have to paddle out to get to the wave, and the ocean has to create the wave, and all those prior experiences matter. And then you need to build on the experiences. Once you catch the wave, you still have to ride it. You have to know how to ride that wave. And so we need to help people create those subsequent experiences that maximize the value that's created by museum experiences. And if we do this, we will create learning environments and learning experiences that truly last a lifetime and are memorable for people and support their learning, be it science or history or art or whatever, across their life, that they will be able to use and bring with them wherever they go, whatever they do, and make them more informed and successful citizens. That's our goal, and we can do that if we pay attention to these factors. So, thank you. And maybe we have a few minutes for some questions, if anybody
Yes, sir.
has any questions.
Yes, and now students, they will ask questions if they have.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
First, introduce yourself, then thereafter ask question.
Yes. Hi, I am Shruti Tevatia. I have a background in biology. I have done my master's in botany. Now I'm pursuing MTech in science communications. So I would like to know something like your personal experience as what you thought about learning earlier, and then some contrasting studies that you found, that sometimes we think something that learning is like that. Like for me, it was during this course that learning is emotional. So that was really surprising and a fascinating information for me. So I know by now you might have been fascinated by so many things, but still something that you would like to share.
Sure. Well, I can talk about emotions, for example. Historically, the way we thought about learning, going back to the influence of people like Descartes, separating mind and body, that there's a long history of thinking of learning is this rational process that separated from emotions. In fact, choices and decisions are best made if we can be rational about it. But there has been a whole range of research, fairly recent research, that has exploded those notions and demonstrated that all choices, all decisions involve emotions, all learning involves emotions. Emotions are involved in every aspect of our choices and learning. So I did a study at a science center in California where I compared, it happened to be an ideal exhibit for this. It was an exhibit on fear, the science of fear. And I was able to show that individuals who were able to couple a highly charged emotional experience with concepts that were being taught at that exhibit showed significantly greater learning of those concepts and over a longer period of time than individuals who saw those concepts without any high emotional experience. And that the coupling of emotion and and learning of a concept together had greater significance than either one by themselves. And of course, if it was by design, the experiences in this exhibit were designed not to scare you to death, but just startle you. So they were pretty mild and along the lines of fear and emotion. But for example, there was an exhibit where you were supposed to stick your hand into a black box, and you could see behind that black box there was a snake. There was no snake in the black box, but people were very nervous about sticking their hand into a black box where they could visually see a snake behind it. So there were those kinds of things. So again, and the exhibit then talked about why we're afraid of snakes and things like that. Another experience, I was on an exhibit design team building an exhibit on ecosystems. And the lead scientist, was convinced that the way people learn is sequentially. And so he wanted to create the experiences in this exhibit sequentially. And he wanted to force visitors to walk a certain path, and he would build the concepts that he was trying to communicate in that way. And I told him, well, that's great. You can work really hard to build those exhibits in a linear way, but that's not how people use museums. Even if you build it linearly, first of all, people will come in the back way and go through the exhibit in the reverse order that you planned. People, if they see that there are people looking at this exhibit, they'll go around them and go to the next exhibit. They'll just skip it entirely. He didn't believe me. So what I was able to convince him was, well, let's do prototypes and we'll mock them up. And we'll design the exhibit in two different ways. In one way, we'll do it the way you want it. We'll build it linearly, and we'll make it a path that people have to follow. And in the other way, we will design it so that all the concepts are there, but it doesn't matter what order you see them in. And this was the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, by the way. This is a big museum. And we mocked up these two different exhibit design ways of approaches, and we left them each there for 3 weeks. And we randomly sampled visitors from each of those experiences and tried to understand what they learned. And lo and behold, the people who learned the most were the people in the open plan. And he was convinced, and that's how we built the exhibit. Um, and if I wasn't part of that team, they would have tried, as many people do, to make it as simple, linear, and force people along a single path on the belief, because that's how we teach in school, or that's how you teach in a book, that's how it should be. But these are not books, and these are not schools, and people learn differently in these contexts. So
That was
those,
really interesting to know. And also, with that sequential thing, does that also come in your term? Like, did you also kept that in mind while you were terming, you termed this free choice learning thing? And also, I do think, now I'm thinking it like that I always try to read sequentially. I just go like, no, first I'll have to read these chapters and then I'll go to this part which is interesting. And I never could reach there, okay, because I just can't go. But yeah, also I wanted to know about this free choice learning. Did you also consider this thing, this sequential learning, in that you didn't need no sequence, it will be a free choice?
well, again, we can think about what's optimum, but the essence of free choice learning is that people learn the way they learn and do what they do. And so there are times when clearly sequence matters and is important, but if we can't control that, then the fact that it might be optimal is irrelevant. So I wasn't arguing with the scientists about whether creating that sequence was the optimal way that someone might learn that. What I was arguing with him was that in the reality of a museum, it's not optimal because people don't do that. And so we need to accommodate the realities of how and when and why people learn the way they learn, particularly in spaces like museums. They are not sequential places. And so we shouldn't design experiences that require it to be sequential, even if that might be the best way to do it. But in other contexts, like a classroom or a book, books are, it's pretty hard. You know, people start at page 1 and read through. That's just sort of the way it is. And so books are learning resources that afford that sequential nature. Museums are learning resources that actually do not primarily afford sequence in the same way. So we need to design learning experiences that are consistent with the affordances. A movie is an example. A film is, it has a sequence, which you can stop it and go back, but most people don't. Most people watch a film from beginning to end. That's just the way it is. And so if you want to use a film as a learning resource, then you need to design it in a way that that sequence supports what you're trying to communicate. But websites, on the other hand, are not sequential. People hop around a website randomly. So you could design it to be sequential, but no one to use it that way. So again, we need to be mindful of the affordances and constraints of the medium that we're using. Each medium has its own unique affordance and constraints.
Hello, sir. I am Nikhil Kumar Singh, and my background is in bachelor's in mechanical engineering. Sir, I have a question regarding you talked about how the kids interact with exhibits which they have prior knowledge. So, sir, what about the exhibits? For example, they see out of blue. They do not have any idea regarding it. How do they interact, or they just pass from it? What is their reaction to it?
Well, so first of all, if you're designing a museum, or if you work in a museum, if you're designing exhibits for a museum or you work in a museum of any size, you need to accept the fact that not everybody will interact with every exhibit, and that not everybody needs to interact with every exhibit to have a good experience and a positive experience. The goal of the museum should be that everybody who comes in can find something that piques their curiosity and interest and satisfies their learning needs, so that collectively the experience meets the needs of everybody, but not necessarily every exhibit meets the needs of everybody. And so it all depends on what that particular exhibit, what your goal for that exhibit is, given that broader, larger goal. Is this the exhibit that is designed for the people who have the specific interest? Or is this the exhibit that's designed for everybody? Everybody needs to see this exhibit and have this experience to be successful. So if it's the core exhibit of the museum, then you would design it one way. If it's a specialized exhibit that is in a particular section of the museum, an exhibition about a particular principle or concept, then you can be narrower and more specific. So again, you can't give one answer that will satisfy all needs. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that exhibit. And there should be room and there should be opportunity in a large museum to have both kinds of exhibits. Exhibits that meet specific needs for people with specific interests, and exhibits that meet broad needs and satisfy the initial curiosity of each individual, or even ideally exhibits that have sufficient depth and complexity that you can use it both initially and quickly get the idea, but if you spend more time, it's open-ended enough that you could keep playing with it for hours. And the longer you play with that exhibit, the more information you get out of it. That's just being clever. And so there is not a single answer to that question, unfortunately.
Sir, is there any balance between these two, the interactive and the ratio, anything?
Well, the balance, again, needs to be struck across the entire institution, not don't think of it as being within a single exhibit, but think of that balance being across the entire institution. You want to have experiences that everybody can get something from, and you want to have experiences that allow people to go into depth. And it needs to be clear to people which are which, by the labeling and by the positioning, by their size, how you arrange them in space. And so think of this as a whole as opposed to just the parts. This is sort of what I was alluding to. We often design experiences in museums piece by piece, as opposed to stepping back and trying to think about the whole and designing the experience as a whole experience, because that's how the public experiences it. The public doesn't experience it piece by piece. The public sees this whole museum full of stuff. How are they going to navigate this? So we need to help them navigate that by thinking ourselves of these as pieces that collectively make a whole. So that's the best I can do.
John, can I just ask
Thank you,
one
sir.
small question? I know you
Yes.
have some other program. The learning in terms of cognitive or motivation, interest, skill development. Which of the aspect do you think the science centers are much better than other?
Well, actually, all of them, but again, it depends on the individual. So there's evidence that virtually, I mean, in my opinion, everybody who goes to a museum comes away enriched and having learned something. For some people, it can be skills. For some people, it can be cognitive. Um, a lot depends on their motivation for coming. Again, if you're there as a parent for your child, most of what you're learning is what your children find interesting, and you're learning through the eyes of your children. If you're coming there for yourself, you learn different things. If you're coming there as an electrical engineer, you learn different things than if you coming there as a botanist. Um, uh, and so the wonder of museums and science centers is that they create this free choice learning opportunity that people can make of it what they find important and useful to them. And so I think universally, most people who go to science centers find them exciting and enjoyable. And so clearly that affective part is really an important part of the experience. Everybody who goes learns something cognitively, but it's not likely to be the same thing that everybody learns. So I have found it much more useful to rather than give people a test at the end that says, you know, here were the big ideas. Did you learn them? Better to find out. So talk to me about your experience and what you learned when you were there. What stood out? What was memorable? So there's cognitive learning, but again, it tends to be often very personalized and idiosyncratic. And people can and do learn skills there. So there isn't a simple answer. I wish there was a simple answer. It's complicated, but yeah. And I do apologize, but I do need. I made a mistake. A lot of things were happening over a few weeks while I was away, and I essentially double booked this time, and so I have an obligation to another conference that I'm supposed to be giving a talk there in about 20 minutes, and I need to go be part of that conference so I can prepare for giving my talk there in about 20 minutes.
So,
Oh,
I
nice of
do.
you, John, that you have agreed to talk to our students and our colleagues, and you have been my great what do you call? I am fan of yours, and ever since I knew about you, and I met you several times in the STC or World Science Center Congress, or even in India. So it has
Yes.
been great learning about you, and so I thought that your talk would be very inspirational to our young colleagues who are, aspiring to join the museum profession or are already in the science center profession. Thank
Yes,
you
well,
once again. Thank
you're
you.
very welcome. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And
you.
it was wonderful I wish I had more time to chat with all of you. I did give my email. If anybody has a follow-up question, feel free to follow up by email with me.